Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda. And in this episode, we're going to dive deep into Hebrews 11:37. And by the way, if you've been enjoying the videos that we've been producing here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse channel, please subscribe, like, tell your friends about it. Also, if you'd like to support William Albrecht and myself, we both are on Patreon, and we appreciate your financial support because we're diving deep into these subjects, and that involves acquiring some rare material. Sometimes it's costly. So if you can help defray some of the expenses, we truly appreciate it. But enough about that. Let's talk about today's video. We've already staked out the case for Hebrews 11:35b, that the Epistle of Hebrews is explicitly quoting or referencing 2 Maccabees 6 and 7 as sacred scripture. And often there is a foil that is raised against this type of argument, namely Hebrews 11:37, because it's said that the author of Hebrews is also making a direct reference to a document known as the Ascension of Isaiah. And so if it's referencing the Ascension of Isaiah, then that would mean Ascension of Isaiah is canonical, and that would prove too much. Now, I think the power behind this is that for most Bible students, you may recall seeing in a footnote or maybe even reading in a commentary something about the Ascension of Isaiah. And so you would think, well, that sounds like a very good argument. But is that true? Is that really what Protestant commentators say, that the author of Hebrews is actually dependent upon this particular work? Well, that's what we're going to investigate today on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. So fasten your seatbelts, because the apocalypse is about to begin. Okay, so now let's take a look at the text, and why don't we give a little bit of running start before we begin? Of course, the question is the author of the Epistle of Hebrews directly dependent upon the Ascension of Isaiah in 11:37? So let's start with 35 and work our way forward, shall we? Okay, it says, quote, "Women received back their dead through resurrection. Some were tortured and would not accept deliverance in order to obtain a better resurrection." Verse 36, "Others endured mockery, scourging, even chains and imprisonment." 37, "They were stoned, sawed in two, put to death at sword's point. They went about in skins of sheep or goats, needy, afflicted, tormented," unquote. So, of course, there in 35b, you see that there's a reference to 2 Maccabees 6 and 7. We've already talked about that in a previous video called the Apocrypha Apocalypse Challenge. You could check that out on the channel and get all the deets. In fact, it'll probably make more sense if you watch that before you watch this video. But moving on, notice he moves from being very specific, because he gives three identifying markers about who he's referring to, who these people are. Afterwards, it gets more and more general. So starting at 36, he says, "Others endured mockery, scourging, even chains and imprisonment." So blanket statements about the types of torture people endured who had supernatural faith during the Old Covenant era. They were stoned, sawed in two, put to death at sword's point. Now we'll just stop right there, because the sawed in two is what we're going to be focusing on today. So some were stoned, some were sawed in two. Now the question is this a direct reference to the Ascension of Isaiah? Well, if you look at the Greek text, what you find is, starting in verse 37, that the author is giving single Greek words, which is very interesting. So the phrase that's translated sawn in two is a single Greek word, a priesthesein. That's it. Nothing else, just a single Greek word. And it's not actually a very rare word in antiquity. It just means sawn. or actually in this form, it means something like sawn through or sawn in two. It's based on the root prizo, and prizo is also used in the Greek Old Testament. And we'll talk about that in a second. So, can we determine dependency on a single Greek word that's not especially rare? Well, I think that would raise our suspicions that perhaps the objector is overreaching here, because obviously, unless this is an extremely rare word, and unless there is some sort of context in which demands that we see a parallel literary device going on here along with a rare word, it's very hard to say, yes, this is absolutely dependent. It may be, but just on that single word, it's not. Now, as I promised in the introduction, I want to look at commentaries, and we're going to look at Protestant commentaries, just like we did similarly with Hebrews 11:35b, which, by the way, in a previous video, as you'll find on this channel, you'll see 50 commentaries on Hebrews 11:35b, where I pull a selection from old commentaries, new commentaries, scholarly commentaries, popular commentaries, from Arminian to Reformed, everything you could think of, a nice swath of Protestant commentaries, and we looked at that and what they had to say about who or what is being referenced in 35b. I want to do something similar here. I'm not going to go through all 50 commentaries. Fortunately, many commentaries don't necessarily speak on every single verse in particular. Sometimes they just make general comments. But did the scholars actually connect this word directly with the ascension of Isaiah? And that is the question that we're going to ask. So let's go to the commentaries. And I have to admit that in the back of my mind, I do remember comments about the ascension of Isaiah, but I just assumed that they were making a direct connection between the two texts. But if you look at what the scholars actually say, they really don't. And for good reason. For, like we just said, it's just a single word, and it just they will pick out ascension of Isaiah as one of several possibilities. So our first commentary is the Epistle of Hebrews, commentary on the Greek text, New International Greek Testament commentary, put out by Erdman's by Paul Ellingworth. And Ellingworth says, and here he gives that one word that we just mentioned. He says, quote, "The reference is certainly to the non-canonical, but pre-Christian tradition that Isaiah was sawn into under Manasseh." And then it cites the ascension of Isaiah, 2nd century BC or later, and also the lives of the prophets, and also several texts from rabbinical text, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, so on and so forth. The verb is used elsewhere of the atrocity committed by Damascus against Gilead, Amos 1:3, of the punishment for sexual offense, Daniel in the Deuterocanonical section known as Susanna, 13:59. So I want you to look here. Notice that Ellingworth does not say that 1137 comes from the ascension of Isaiah. Rather, he says it seems to have come from a pre-Christian tradition concerning Isaiah, who, by the way, is a biblical character, and so the argument still stands regardless. And then he gives several examples of texts that reference this tradition. Also notice that he points out that the verb is used elsewhere for atrocity committed by Damascus against Gilead in Amos 1:3. Now, this is found in the Septuagint version of Amos 1:3, where it says, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 crimes of Damascus and for 4, I will not revoke my word, because they threshed Gilead with sledges of iron." I think this is the first difficulty that arises from trying to make 1137 speak about the ascension of Isaiah, is that we do have Old Testament characters who are explicitly said to have been torn in two or sawed in two. In this case, it's the Gileads or the Gileadites. And notice here in the Septuagint that twice the Greek word prizo, which is the root of the word used in 37, is used back to back in the Septuagint. So you actually have this being emphasized about the son in two. And I think this takes a lot of air out of the fact that this can only refer to Isaiah and only refer to the ascension of Isaiah. Obviously, this commentator, and this is a very scholarly work, doesn't pinpoint the ascension of Isaiah. And he even shows that, yes, in the Greek Old Testament, this verb is also used. And by the way, in Deuterocanon, one of the sinful Jews, is the punishment is to be also sawn in two as well. So the idea is out there, and it may even be a reference to Amos 1:3, but that's beside the point. The point is that this commentator does not see Hebrews 11:37 as being directly dependent upon ascension of Isaiah. Now, that's just one commentary. Let's continue. This commentary is by is the Word Biblical Commentary, a very prestigious Protestant evangelical commentary. It's on Hebrews 9 through 13, which would be volume 37b by William L. Lane. And Lane has this to say: suggested by the euphonic similarity in sound, aprithesen, they were sawn in two, presupposes a familiarity with the tradition concerning the death of Isaiah. Cf. Lives of the Prophets 1:1, which, by the way, is probably a pre-Christian work that mentions the martyrdom of Isaiah being sawn in two. In fact, he gives a quote: he met his death at the hands of Manasseh, sawn in two. The source of the tradition appears to have been an old genealogical book found in Jerusalem, and then he quotes several rabbinic sources to support that. Accordingly to these mutually complementary rabbinic sources, Manasseh, enraged because Isaiah had prophesied the destruction of the temple, ordered his arrest. Isaiah fled to the hill country and hid in a trunk of a cedar tree. He was discovered when the king ordered the tree cut down. Isaiah was tortured with a saw because he had taken refuge in the trunk of the tree. A Christian source, the Ascension of Isaiah. Now notice he identifies the Ascension of Isaiah as actually being a Christian source, which is very odd because if you recall in Hebrews 11:2 and also 11:39, it speaks of the elders who had gained approval. So this is speaking of pre-Christian stuff, but obviously if the Ascension of Isaiah is a Christian writing, a direct reference to that work wouldn't really fit in very well. But enough of that. He says, a Christian source, the Ascension of Isaiah, contains the vestiges of an older Jewish writing related to the martyrdom of Isaiah, but the tradition is reported in elliptical fashion, and then he cites various sources to that effect. It continues, the practice of sawing men in two was perpetrated by the Romans at the time of the Jewish War, and also sawn, and also by certain Cyrenian Jews during the insurrection in AD 115. So very interesting comments there. Notice he doesn't say Isaiah 11:37 is dependent upon Ascension of Isaiah. Notice he says Ascension of Isaiah is actually a Christian work that harkens to an earlier Jewish tradition. In other words, it was just a common belief in the first century that that is how Isaiah died. So it's probably not a specific reference to a particular writing. Moving on, we have Donald Guthrie's commentary, Hebrews, an Introduction and Commentary, volume 15 of the Tyndale New Testament Commentaries. In 37, it says, quote, another list of hardships of even more acute kind is next enumerated. Death by stoning was well-established method of execution. And the words, they were sawn in two, are considered to be an allusion of the tradition of Isaiah's death as recorded by both Justin and Origen. Now, those are two Christian writers. The apocryphal book, The Ascension of Isaiah, relates the death of Isaiah in this way. Death by the edge of the sword was also commonly used in the time. So here we have Guthrie, who notes that in this particular section that he's making reference to common ways of death, common torture. He does not say that this comes directly from the Ascension of Isaiah, but rather he just says the apocryphal work does relate Isaiah's death in this way. Okay, so again, we don't see any direct connection. How about Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown? They just give it one line here in their critical and explanatory commentary on the whole Bible. It says, sawn asunder, as Isaiah was said to have been by Manasseh, but see my introduction to Isaiah. So if you flip to his introduction in Isaiah, he has this to say. It says, most scholars associate the reference of being sawn in two with Isaiah. Although this incident is not mentioned in the Bible, Jewish tradition held that this grisly manner of death for the prophet, see martyrdom and ascension of Isaiah. So he's saying Jewish tradition held this. And then he gives the ascension of Isaiah as an example of this Jewish tradition. So even Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown doesn't mention any kind of dependency or direct reference to the work, but rather it's more of a reference to a tradition that is also manifested in the Ascension of Isaiah. Next, we have Vincent's word studies for the New Testament. Very short entry. It says they were sawn asunder. New Testament as Isaiah according to tradition. Again, so we have Vincent's word study saying that this is according to Jewish tradition. It's not, he doesn't pick out that this came from the Ascension of Isaiah. Moving on to A.T. Robinson's word pictures in the New Testament. He writes, they were sawn asunder. And first aorist passive indicative of prio or prizo, old verb prenen, a saw. Cruel Jewish punishment, Amos 1:3, said to have been inflicted on Isaiah. So he notes that this word is used as a punishment in Amos 1:3, and that it was said to have been inflicted on Isaiah. He doesn't give any references where that comes from. He just very vaguely references that as a kind of tradition. The Faithlight Study Bible has this. Sawn in two, likely an allusion to the traditions, notice plural, the traditions surrounding the prophet Isaiah. First to the second works influenced by Judaism record that Isaiah died during Manasseh's reign by being sawn in two. Lives of the prophets, so that's that early Jewish work on the martyrdoms of the prophets that mentioned Isaiah being sawn in two. We read that a little bit ago. Compare martyrdom of Isaiah. So the Faith Life Study Bible says that this comes from a Jewish tradition about Isaiah, and it gives two possible sources that reflect that tradition. Again, it doesn't say Hebrews is drawing from the Ascension of Isaiah. John MacArthur's their study Bible gives this short entry. Sawn in two, according to tradition. This is the method Manasseh employed to execute Isaiah. Short and sweet, according to tradition. To really see the contrast here, watch the Apocrypha Apocalypse Challenge video, or even better, watch the 50 commentaries video on Hebrews 11:35b. You will see how the commentators are making specific connections between the text of 2 Maccabees 6 and 7 with Hebrews 11:35b. Okay, this is very different from 37, where there is this vague reference to Jewish tradition that's reflected in several works, Jewish tradition, lives of the prophets, Ascension of Isaiah. You just don't have that specificity because after all, you just have that one Greek word. Okay, let's move on to Exel's The Biblical Illustrator, Hebrews volumes 1 and 2. He says this, of sawing professors asunder. We do not read in sacred scripture of any that were sawn asunder. Actually, that's interesting because apparently you missed Amos 1:3. But the Jews, among their other traditions, have this, that the prophet Isaiah was sawn asunder with a wooden saw in the time of King Manasseh. Epiphanius, in the setting out Isaiah's life, knew this as much. So doth Jerome, or Jerome, in the last close of the 15th book in his commentary on Isaiah. Whether it be true of Isaiah or not, most sure it was that some have after such a manner been martyred, either by sawing them asunder or by pulling the members of their body asunder. This testimony of the apostles is sufficient to assure us of the truth thereof, and giveth an instance of the cruelty of the persecutors, which showeth itself even in the death of the martyrs. That's very interesting. First, he says that it is among the Jewish traditions, okay, and then he gives some details. Actually, the details come from the Ascension of Isaiah, but he doesn't specify that. And he notes that some early church fathers also mention Isaiah dying this way. But he says whether or not this is Isaiah, and that's interesting that he's willing to concede this might not even be about Isaiah. He says, we know that there were people martyred in such a way, either by sawing them asunder or by pulling the members of the body asunder. So he actually sees in this word a reference to maybe an even larger, different kind of martyrdom than the other commentaries do. But he says, but since the apostle attests basically that this is so, then we know that it must be true and that there were martyrs that died this way. So that's the Joseph S. Axel commentary. The Bullinger, Companion to the Bible, being the authorized version of 1611 with the structures and notes, says this. Sawn asunder, Greek prizo, only here. Well, as we saw, that's not true. It's also there in Amos 1:3. It's also there in Daniel 13. This is the death of Isaiah during Manasseh persecution. CP 2 Kings 21:16, according to the Gemara. The Gemara, by the way, is a commentary on the Mishnah, and that is rabbinical source. So drops the ball in regards to the use of the Greek word prizo. Nevertheless, states that this is according to Jewish tradition. But it's interesting, the wording, if you didn't follow it to the end and know what the Gemara is, you could be confused to think he's actually saying that this is some way from the Ascension of Isaiah directly. So we have Linda Belleville's Cornerstone Biblical Commentary. She actually is a bit more specific. Says, sawn in half, Isaiah's death in this way is detailed in the Martyrdom and Ascension of Isaiah 5:11. And then she quotes from Isaiah, Ascension of Isaiah 5:11. Notice she doesn't say that it's dependent upon it. She just says that his death is detailed in similar fashion there. So that's probably the strongest that you'll have as far as the connection to the Ascension of Isaiah. James Thompson's Paideia commentary, the New Testament, says, quote, according to tradition, Isaiah was sawn in two, Martyrdom of Isaiah. Compare Susanna 59 for the method of execution. So he reckons that, yeah, prizo is used in the Septuagint because he stood firm when other Israelites turned away. Okay. So it's according to tradition, again, exemplified in the Ascension of Isaiah. It wasn't dependent on Isaiah. He's not making a reference to that particular work. Rather, he's referencing the tradition about Isaiah's death. William Newcomb's commentary has, they were sawn asunder. a supposed allusion to the manner of Isaiah's death. So not exactly firm, but just as a supposed allusion. Now here's a rather lengthy quote from John Gill's commentary. I don't know if we'll read it all, but Gill writes, "There is no instance of any good men being so used in Scripture. Perhaps reference is had to some that suffered thus during the time of Antiochus." So he says, well, maybe this is a veiled reference to the persecutions during the Maccabean period. He said the Jews have a tradition, and I notice he's referring to a tradition, that the prophet Isaiah was sawn asunder during the times of Manasseh, and that by his order, which some think the apostle refers to. Now, notice he says some think that this might be referring to it, though it seems to be all fictitious and ill put together. The tradition is in both Talmuds. In the one, the account is this, that Manasseh sought to kill Isaiah, and he fled from him. He fled to a cedar, and the cedar swallowed him up. All but the fringe of his garment, they came and told him, Manasseh, he said unto them, go and saw the cedar. And they saw the cedar, and blood was seen to come out. So that's one tradition. So he does say that there are some who think that this is a reference to the ascension of Isaiah. It doesn't appear that John Gill follows them. Instead, he quotes from all sorts of sources, none of which come from the ascension of Isaiah. It's all rabbinic sources. So there you have it. Those are the commentaries I looked up, and I think it's a decent selection of commentaries, a lot of scholarly commentaries. And although you might have a couple that come pretty close to saying that 37 is some way drawn from or attached to or referencing Isaiah or the ascension of Isaiah, as you can tell, most commentators don't say that. What they say is that the author of Hebrews is referring to a broad general tradition, which is found in several sources, not just the ascension of Isaiah, but also the lives of the prophets. And it's witnessed also in rabbinical documents and so on, that Isaiah was sawn in two. Some commentaries actually loosen it up a little bit, that it may not even be a reference to Isaiah. And some commentaries note that the use of the word prizo in all its different forms is also used in the Old Testament. And so we do have Old Testament backing for this type of torture being inflicted. So I just hope that this kind of blows the dust and cobwebs off our memories in terms of this verse, because I know many times you walk away and you have this impression, well, this has something to do with the ascension of Isaiah. Then you think, oh, well, that must mean that it's a reference to that work. Well, as we've seen in the Greek, that's very, very dubious that you can make such a connection. And as we've seen with these commentaries, the scholars don't either. They'll just make a blanket statement that there were some martyrs that occurred, and that prominent among them was Isaiah, and this was part of a larger pre-Christian tradition. So I hope you found this video helpful, and until next time, take care. Bye-bye.